Okay, and you guys are going after this kind of fraud hard right now.
We are, especially with this new initiative that the Attorney General announced last week.
Okay, and what is the main takeaway that you want consumers to know about? If this happens to you, what do you do?
Time is of the essence in these types of scams because the longer the money is unaccounted for, i.e. the longer the fraud goes undetected or unreported, the more likely it is that the subjects are going to be able to move that money to additional banks outside of the reach of law enforcement. So a victim really needs to take 3 steps. And this applies not just to the business email compromise scams, but really to any type of wire fraud scam in which they lose money through a fraudulent wire transfer. First, they need to alert their bank to the fraud and see if their bank can do what's called a wire recall to get the money back from the receiving bank. Then they need to call the local FBI field office. And the reason why it's important to call your local FBI office, especially here in Tampa, our folks here are trained, both our operators that are here 24/7 in the building, as well as the agents in our resident agencies or satellite offices, that when they're alerted to a business email compromise scheme, there's immediate actions that they take, which includes reaching out to the bank that received those funds. Or in the case of an overseas transfer, we have a protocol that we followed to try to recover that money from the overseas bank. So that's why it's critical that they contact the FBI office. Then the third step is to file a report with the Internet Crime Complaint Center, www.ic3.gov. That's the FBI's clearinghouse, a reporting center for all types of wire fraud.
Okay, and a lot of people are surprised that they can call the FBI, but if they call their local field office, someone will answer the phone?
You have to go through a menu-driven prompts, but eventually you will get to somebody, a live person to talk to.
And they'll be able to do something immediately?
Yes. And
Okay.
that's why you want to make sure that if you do get in that situation, when you talk to the FBI, you tell them that this is a business email compromise, because those are the key words that we look for. And again, that puts into play a series of different actions that we're required to take to try to get that money back.
Okay, so once you tell whoever you're speaking with the FBI that is a business, what is it?
Business email compromise.
Business email compromise. Those are the key words
Yes.
that set something into action.
That's right.
And so they will call the bank that received the money. And I think that's what happened with the lady that we interviewed, Brittany. She says she called the bank and they wouldn't talk to her. They thought she was the scammer.
And that's true. And I've heard that from a number of other victims. They will call the receiving bank, and since they're not a customer of that receiving bank, the receiving bank doesn't share any information with them. And in many cases, the receiving bank also won't or is prohibited from sharing information with the victim bank. So that's why you really need to get law enforcement involved, because obviously we're law enforcement. We have contacts in many banks that will be able to provide us with more accurate or more complete information than if the victim or the victim's bank tries to get that information.
Okay. So when you guys get involved, though, you call the bank, and what do they do? How do you get the money back?
It depends on a number of different factors, including how long it's been since the transfer took place, as well as how cooperative that bank is. Because some banks are very cooperative with us, both in terms of providing information and freezing funds. Other banks are not as cooperative. So it really depends, again, on that individual bank and their policies, as well as the relationship that our investigators have with fraud investigators at those different banks.
So you've actually had banks that you guys are saying, we think this person is being scammed, we want to stop the money, and they still don't turn it over?
Yes, that happens quite a bit, actually.
So then if you go on to investigate after that, do you go after that bank for letting it slip through the cracks?
No, because technically the bank hasn't done anything illegal or wrong, but it just confounds the problem that law enforcement faces. When you look at the numbers at the rate at which this crime problem is growing, we need all hands on deck to get together to try to put an end to this. And that's not just law enforcement, but it's also victims. That includes both private citizens as well as, in this case, the real estate industry, because they're the most heavily targeted industry. But it also includes the banks. We need help from the banks to get on board with us to cooperate with law enforcement, because again, it really is going to take an initiative and effort by everybody involved to put an end to this problem.
One would think if you're the bank, you get a call from the FBI, you would take it seriously.
And I don't think it's a question of necessarily taking it seriously, but it's a question of what that bank's own internal policies allow it to do in terms of its cooperative stance with the FBI.
So Brittany, the lady we interviewed, she got lucky then that you guys were able to get that money back for her. It was $102,000.
Yes.
Substantial amount of money, and she did get it back. She got it back within 5 days of calling the FBI.
Great. That doesn't always happen. In some cases, we have to do seizure warrants, and that typically happens when either the victim or the receiving bank, for whatever reason, they've frozen the funds, but they can't return them for one reason or another. And that takes typically 6 to 12 months to get back.
Wow, wow. So she got really lucky
She
then
did
to
get
get it
really
back in
lucky.
5 days. So this is happening a lot. How often are you able, or how often does the victim get money back?
We are successful in our recoveries about 80% of the time.
Okay.
For domestic transactions. For international transactions, it's about 40% of the time. As you can imagine, it's much more difficult when you're talking about an overseas bank, whether or not it has a corresponding U.S. bank. We still have to go and alert law enforcement, alert that foreign bank, and hopefully get them to cooperate with us. But again, our success rate's around 40%.
Do these scammers typically use domestic banks or international banks?
I don't know what percentage are international versus domestic, but the majority of them are domestic.
Okay, okay. So that's in your favor?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I estimate around 3/4 of them are domestic transfers.
Mm-hmm. So the biggest takeaway, if it's happened to you, is time. Get on it
Absolutely.
quickly and call your bank, call the FBI.
Yes.
Don't waste any time. Now, as far as prevention, what sorts of things should you look for? Because when people are buying a house, they get caught up in the excitement, and I understand that these scammers can be pretty cunning in the way they send these emails to trick very educated people.
And that's one of the most frustrating things that I face is this is really an easy scam to defeat. In all cases, the victims send out money based upon a fraudulent email with bogus wiring instructions. It's what we call a spoofed email, meaning it comes from an email address that is very similar to the legitimate sender's email address, but is typically off by one character. So the victim receives these wiring instructions, doesn't do any kind of follow-up or double check, but they initiate that wire transfer based purely upon that email. The best way to defeat this scam is by picking up the phone, calling the sender of that email, or who you think is the sender of that email, the legitimate person that you've been involved in this business discussion with, whether it's for the purchase of real estate or a business-to-business transaction, meaning the payment of an invoice. Call that person that supposedly sent that email. And don't call the number on the bottom of the email, because we're seeing that some of those scammers will change the legitimate sender's email to their phone number. So that way, if the person does call, it's going to the subject and not to the legitimate sender.
Okay.
But that's the easiest way to defeat this scheme.
Use the phone number you've used before
Exactly.
and talk to that person.
Just like if you get an email, a phishing email from your bank that alerts you to a potentially fraudulent transaction. Don't call the number in the email, call the number on the back of your credit card, on the back of your statement that you know is the legitimate or the bank's legitimate number.